Okay. Well, what's on docket, if you guys didn't hear me, is self-testing, postural evaluation, and shoulder impingement. So the Human Matrix, September 15th and 16th. Okay, thank you. Thank you, man. All right, and then what else we got going on? I might be going to Australia, peeps, in July. So if you're in Australia in the month of July, late July, and you want to listen to me talk, it's probably going to be day one of the Human Matrix. Stay tuned. I'll probably release a little bit more information there once I get a little bit more information on that. What else we got going on? The product that I'm doing, I don't know what it's called yet, but my case study product where I basically go through cases and I do a little bit of commentary. We figure out this is what you do for this type of person, that type of person. It's a great way to learn. It's essentially like the way that I learned when I worked with Bill when I was his intern. I would watch him a lot, learn that way, and you're kind of doing that with me. And you can learn a lot about how to incorporate some of the variability stuff that I discuss with your clientele. So I would definitely go ahead and check that out. We made a little bit of ground. I'm hoping to release that at some point this year, but with Australia coming up as well, that might be putting a little bit of a slowdown on things because I kind of got to pick it up on the Human Matrix. So stay tuned. Anything else? That's really it in life. Weekend was pretty good. I hope you guys have a stellar weekend. And without further ado, let's debrief, shall we? First question comes from Ian. Ian asks, any way to self-diagnose to tell if a muscle's tight because it's weak or tight because it's too strong? Please don't say muscle testing. Thanks. Ian, that is a great question. And I won't say muscle testing because I don't really use that stuff. You can check out one of the debriefs that I did on muscle testing if you so desire to learn my thoughts on that. Now, here's one thing that we have to consider. If a muscle is, what does Ian say? If a muscle is tight. So what I think Ian means by tight is the perception that something feels tight, tense, or toned. And there could be a scenario where you have a muscle that is relatively contracted in a concentric position, which we'll call short, or an eccentric position, which we'll call long. And how do you tell the difference between the two? And I really don't know if whether it's short versus long is really the question we need to be asking. I think the question we need to be asking is, does someone have movement capabilities in all three planes? Because if you can restore that, regardless of whether we theorize this is a concentric or eccentric orientation of a muscle, you have at least a fighting chance of reduced tightness, because the length-tension relationship of the muscles, theoretically, if you have a normalization of the joint range of motion at each joint in all three planes, should be relatively okay. So that's really what you have to be seeking, I think. Not necessarily trying to self-diagnose why something is feeling tight. If you restore joint range of motion, you ought to be in business. So how can you tell what you need to work on if you don't have someone to test? Like, you ain't be working with Big Z. I'm glad you asked. There's a few proxy tests that you can use. I don't think nothing beats an evaluation, but there's a few tests that I think you can look at to see and get a general idea in terms of what your needs are. The first one, you guys know what it's going to be. I'm going to say infrasternal angle because you can measure that on yourself. A couple ways to do that. You can either do the thumb test. So if I tilt myself down, and because my mentee Adil will give me some flack, I won't show off my chest. But if you find your xiphoid process, which is the rubbery portion of your sternum, so you got hard rubber. Put your thumb on there, go to one side of the rib cage. Put your other thumb together, go on the other side, and measure the angle. And you can see Big Z be narrow as all hell. So I would require a narrow protocol. Some people are going to be wide, so you can check that. So if you got an angle that's, say, greater than 100 degrees, maybe 105, 140. You're one of these guys or gals, you're going to need a wide protocol. I'll link that stuff in the show notes. If you're asymmetrical, now big key, guys, this is something with asymmetrical, because I'm getting this a lot, and it's probably because I poorly explained it. But asymmetrical isn't this and then that, because that's still relatively narrow. Asymmetrical would be something like this and that, right? Where I'm clearly narrow on one side and I'm wide on the other. And if you don't trust your thumbs, I trust mine, but if you don't trust your thumbs, what I would do is lie on your back, knees bent, do the selfie pose, take a picture of this area on you. Let me do that again, this area. We want to see this. And you can go on the computer, and I've done this for some people. They say, hey, Zach, what's my infrasternal angle? Well, show me your chest. And what I do is I just draw a line from the xiphoid process to the belly button, and then you can see where your ribs are, and then you just draw some lines and say, oh, yeah, that angle is this or that. I think that's a big test, and that drives a lot of my decision-making clinically. And I think if you just at least know that and you follow the infrasternal angle protocols that I've discussed in prior debriefs, you're going to be doing okay. You're halfway there, and you might hit a lot of the needs that you have. So something to consider. Other things I would consider looking at, a toe touch to squat test. What that is, simple. Well, actually, it would be two tests. You stand up nice and tall, lock your knees, go ahead, bend forward, touch your toesies. Can you do it? I'm close today. Okay, that would be one piece. What that would tell you would be, do you need some type of activity to reduce extensor tone? You don't know where, though, unfortunately. You go there, and then you can see if you can descend into a squat, which looks at very similar things. But it also tells us, do you have enough posterior hip motion to be able to descend in a squat? A lot of different things. And those two tests are also very good self-tests to look at. Now, what do you do for those? Well, infrasternal angle can take care of a lot of the problems there, but I think in the squat in particular, basically what it tells you is if you can't do that, well, you ought to do things to practice doing that. And depending on what your infrasternal angle is, you might utilize one variation versus another if you have a limited toe touch to squat. For example, with a narrow infrasternal angle, so a guy like Big Z, or a girl, whatever, what I might do is I might do a counterweight squat. And so what that would be is you got a ball, you got a weight out in front like so, you're dropping down into that squat position, and you're squeezing the snot out of the ball. The reason why that is, the snot squeezing, is because if you squeeze the snot out of the ball, it's going to really kick in the adductors. Typically, the infrasternal and infrapubic angle, so the infrapubic angle would be if you got your pubic symphysis, the angle of the pubis is narrow. And if you want to open up the infrapubic angle, you need yourself some adductors, because that pries them open. So if you squeeze the ball and you descend into the squat, boom, you're in business. You hit both of your infrasternal and infrapubic angles simultaneously in the way you need it. If you're a wide infrasternal angle, and typically for wides, we advocate a bit more overhead motion. What you do for that is you would do a sink squat. So I do this a lot. Find a kitchen sink. I don't have one in my room. Imagine. You grab the kitchen sink, you lean back as best as you can, so your arms are relatively overhead, ball still between the knees, and then I descend to the squat. So the arms are still relatively overhead. That's going to allow you to get a little bit more than phenomenal abdominals. And you don't necessarily squeeze the ball in this case. Because if we are saying that the infrasternal and infrapubic angles generally match, the infrapubic angle is also going to be wide. The infrapubic angle is too open. You probably already got a little bit too much out of them adductors, fam. So what you want to do is just use the ball as a placeholder so you get balanced hamstring activity. Because what that's going to do is that's going to help normalize the lumbar curve, get the hips in a good position that you need to be, And of course, you ought to be in business. So that would be another good self-test. Shoulders are a bit tough because you kind of got a good test for lowers with the squat. I think the active mid-stance test for lowers would also be good. I'll link that in the show notes as well. I should probably write this stuff down because I'm going to forget it. Here we go. So the active mid-stance, also another good one because that will give you an idea if you can adduct past midline. That'll give you some ideas of how well you can coordinate things in 3 planes. Lots of good stuff with that. And you can follow some of the stuff that I've written in regards to that. So if you watch the video, it talks about exactly what you need. So you can go after the active mid-stance test, squat, we got toe touch, ISA. What else do I like to use for self-tests? Shoulders, that's what I was talking about. Shoulders are kind of tough because I think it's really hard to gauge internal versus external rotation. And those are really my big decision makers, which I'll talk about later. Dana asked a clarification question. Do you add more hip abduction thorax with a wide ISA? Dana, it depends on how they present. So that's a good question. Dana on that Instagram baby asked if someone who has a wide infrasternal angle needs hip abduction activities. While we're saying that in that people under normal circumstances, the infrapubic angle is relatively wide, if there is something that is occurring compensatorily at the axial skeleton, much like I talked about in that posterior pelvic tilt debrief, which I will link in the show notes, what you can have is, even though the infrapubic angle is wide, because the lumbar spine severely increases its lordosis, that may tilt the pelvis relatively forward. And so what will happen in that case is when you go ahead and test that individual, even though positionally we would think under normal circumstances that abduction would be limited, they wouldn't have the abduction limitation because the pelvis is relatively anteriorly tilted. So you would actually see an adduction limitation. So the point being is you want to treat your tests. If you are with someone, and you'll see this sometimes, where there is an abduction limitation bilaterally or unilaterally, and you don't have an adduction limitation, then yes, I incorporate the abduction exercises. If not, you treat them just the way that I talked about in regards to the squat. So that was a good question, Dana. Uppers, it's hard to accurately assess internal. That's the big thing that I struggle with. Horizontal abduction, also kind of challenging to test by yourself. I think one thing you could potentially look at is a CV trunk rotation, even though that doesn't really isolate it to the T1, T7 area, which is what we kind of want with horizontal. That might also be a good one to give you a proxy measure of what's going on up here. And then you can treat that based on the infrasternal angle. I'll talk a little bit more about this in my course, but generally if you're wide, you're still doing kind of more frontal plane-based things to help open up that side of the rib cage, which will allow for better trunk rotation. Also, if you're a narrow, then I might do more rotational-based activities to drive trunk rotation. And the reason why I go with those two things, it has to do with what's going on with the intercostals in each of those scenarios. So like when you see someone with a narrow on one side and a wide on the other, well, the wide, it looks like the rib cage is kind of bunched up. You'll see that. Like if this is way high, it just looks like this is relatively shortened. Has to do with what the intercostals are doing on that side, because it's more of an inhalation-based position, and so these guys get a little bit compressed together. So you want to do things that kind of open that up. In the narrow case, if this is way down and this is pulled long, you want to do rotational-based things to essentially close that down. So if I rotate to the left, say this is opened up, and I rotate to the left, I'm going to be relatively closed down on this side, normalizing the intercostal relationship, and open up on the other side. So that's why I emphasize those basic things to restore trunk rotation, depending on what your infrasternal angle is. You can also, it's not my favorite, but it's at least easy to test. You could look at Apley's scratch. test to determine if you have some limitation in shoulder rotation. I don't like it because it's a combined movement. It's really hard to tease out why that movement is limited. What the Apley scratch is, for those who don't know, or maybe you're an FMS or an SFMA cat, it would be your shoulder mobility tests. So the medial rotation extension would be where you reach behind the back and you try to touch the inferior aspect of the opposite scapula. And then the lateral rotation flexion would be where you're trying to touch the superior aspect. So the underside one would be your internal rotation measure. The overside one, the one where you're reaching kind of behind your head and trying to touch the spine of the scapula, that would be your external rotation measure. So you can look at those, and if you're limited in those, you might do activities to help restore external rotation. You might do activities to restore internal rotation in those cases. So those would kind of be the self-tests that I would look at. So to summarize, if you want to get just a general idea of what your movement capabilities are, here's what I would look at. Infrasternal angle first and foremost. I would do a toe touch. Then I would do a toe touch to a squat to give you a little bit idea of sagittal plane stuff, give you an idea of what your hip mobility looks like. I would look at active mid-stance tests. That will allow you to know if you can kind of cross midline when you're adducting your hip. I would look at trunk rotation, and I would look at your Apley's maneuvers, so the IR and ER tests behind the back. See how those turn out, and you at least ought to get an idea in terms of what your movement capabilities are. And if you can address those to the best of your capabilities, you might notice some of the tightness that you have in particular areas going away, regardless of whether or not the muscle is short or long. I don't think you need to know that. So, Ian, that was a phenomenal question. I hope that was helpful, peeps. Next question comes from Carl. Hey, Z Murder. Yes, he called me Z Murder. Not my rap name, but maybe another day. I wondered if you might chat on your debrief on the phenomena of individuals that appear flexed at the thoracic spine, but have an underlying extension pattern going on. I'm wondering how this is first recognized, what structures are flexed and which are extended, and what the genesis, Nas reference for you, which for those who don't know, and if you don't know, I am sorry. Hang on, I'll answer you, Mike. Was the Genesis, Nas reference for you. Genesis was the first track on the quintessential album Illmatic. I will link that in the show notes. That should be number 1 before you listen to any of this other stuff that I have. Of this posture could be. So I will answer that real quick, Carl. Mike says needs left or hip internal rotation. So what I would use is the squat to start, because the femurs have to fall in a relative internal rotation based position, Mike, if you're looking at that. And if you need external rotation, I would go after glute max activity. So it's like the thought process is whatever movement you can't do, try to get yourself into positions to do those. I'll link some stuff in there, but I would look at like posterior hip stretching, and I would look at glute max activities on the right side. So Carl is talking about this phenomenon. That was the question. I just have to answer my boy Mike's question right quick. So you got someone who's got a flex posture, but there's an underlying extension going on. What does that mean? So what I think Carl is talking about is, they've talked about this in PRI, because extension seems to be very big in PRI, that you can have a situation where there's a relative extensor-based activity or extension tone occurring, even though someone appears kyphotic. Let me demonstrate. And actually, this will be a very relevant demonstration for what I think is going on. Watch this. If I take a big breath of air in, and I really drive extension-based stuff in my spine, I can take this huge inhale and watch this. Boom. I can flex. Okay, so basically what I did, if you're not seeing me, breathe in, really extend, and then I just crunch to create that flex posture. So that's kind of what Carl is talking about. But I think this question that Carl asked leads to a much bigger problem, and that is making assumptions based on default posturing. Because in that position that I just did, there was a difference between how I looked and what was going on from a respiration standpoint. So essentially what I did was I took this huge breath of air in. And based on what we know from how ribs move and what the respiratory mechanism looks like, when I breathe in like that, what happened was I should have gotten increased bucket handle expansion of my ribs, so the lower ribs, even though the bucket handle action occurs in the entire rib cage, but the lower ribs should flare out a little bit more. This way, laterally, that's your bucket handle. I should have got increased pump handle, so the T1 to T7 region should kind of go anterior and superior. And then my posterior thorax should have popped back. So you get essentially a 360-degree expansion of the rib cage. Now, what happened here? If I really expand, and maybe I start to arch my back a little bit, well, it looks like I have a reduction in that posterior thorax expansion. But then I can do this. Respiration-wise, we know when I take that breath of air in, we should get expansion 360 degrees of the rib cage. But if somewhere in my spine, I hinge and I do this, flex forward, well, things start to look a little bit different than what we would think from a respiration standpoint. Watch. Breathe in. Well, it looks like I'm getting way good, almost too good posterior thorax expansion. And on the front side, it looks like I have a down pump handle action as opposed to the pump handle increasing as I did with the inhale. Uh-oh. What does that mean? Does that mean I have a down pump handle? False. It does not. Because what happened was I still took a huge inhale in. I was started in a position of inhalation based on what we would know from when I breathe in and you see the bucket handle action happen. But because the human body is incredibly complex and can compensate in multiple areas, I hinged to have a mismatch between what we visualize posturally and what's going on from a respiration standpoint. Hang on one second. Barbo training. Would you be apprehensive of fixing infrasternal angles in this effect shoulder can manage with throwing athletes? Barbo, I will answer that question. Let me go on this tirade real quick. So what I have is a mismatch between what's going on from a respiration standpoint and how I'm presenting posturally. So who do you trust? Because so many different compensatory actions can occur, whether it's from trauma, whether it's from that person just trying to manage their environment and their body, whether it's from a lot of reasons we can't understand. You have to trust respiration. You have to. Because guess what, guys? When I do that same thing where I took a big breath of air in and I hunched over, you don't know where I'm hunching over at. Do I appear kyphotic when I hunch over? Maybe. But how do you guys know that I am not extended at T5 only? And because it's just a slight relative extension position compared to, say, T4, T3, and then T7, T8, the thoracic spine still appears kyphotic or flexed. It's really hard to pinpoint that down from one segment to another to say whether something is flexed or extended, because we just can't know. We don't have X-ray vision. And even when we do have X-ray vision, we don't have a consistent way of testing particular positions based on some of the compensatory actions that we have that we could be accurate. So it's really hard to make some type of diagnosis posturally. You have to trust respiration, because regardless of how you look, that respiratory mechanism is still relatively preserved, because we still have to get air in and out, despite how we look. So I don't rely, I remember I said in a prior debrief, and I can't remember which one it was, that looking at postures is something I'm going to take a bit more stake in. And after many conversations with Bill, after seeing it so many times over and over again, where I'm thinking, man, this guy has a wide infrasternal angle, but it looks like he's got a down pump handle. Or I've seen someone who's got a narrow infrasternal angle, which should have a down pump handle. Watch. boom, I just arch, I hinge, which hashtags me usually. This doesn't make sense. It doesn't match what I'm expecting to see. So I don't check posture as much, or at least I don't put as much stake into it, because it's much more of a guessing game. What I do put a lot of stake in is the respiratory mechanism. So a lot of the tests that I mentioned previously, you want to check those. Tests I'm going to mention in the shoulder portion, you want to check those. That's going to at least give you some ideas, some proxy measures in terms of what is theoretically going on with that person and how they're managing their body position. Because posture is going to change based on a multitude of factors. There's a research study I read way back when, and I have to find it. And I know Brian Chung is listening right now, so he's probably going to love this one. He's probably going to shoot it down as soon as I link it in the show notes. But it showed that there was an association between scapular depression and depression. There's depression or forward shoulders. I can't remember which of the two it is. So could there be some, think of all the things that could potentially lead to depression in someone. There's a lot of links with gut stuff. Could be they're in a rough home life situation. Could be genetics. I mean, there's just so many factors that can influence posture that we don't even think about. I mean, we're thinking about muscles and position and respiration, but there's just so much that can influence that. And it makes it hard to make good, sound clinical decisions. But what I think we can do, and what we can impact people with, is variability testing, doing the best that they can, and forgetting about what they look like, unless carrying themselves in a certain manner is something that they need to change. It's hard to pick up chicks when you're looking like this all the time. That's what I'm saying. So I think posture is important in that regard, but I don't put much stake into it. I put stake into my testing, and that's why I think that is the key. Your testing, the decisions you make as a clinician based on your testing, not just variability, but power, capacity, all the factors that are relevant. And if you do that, depending on, or trying to decipher whether this is a flex position, extended position, or whether they're flex but in an extended system type stuff, don't worry about that. Worry about helping them meet their goals by addressing the relevant needs, and a lot of times that can be done under a variability context. So that's my thoughts on that question, Carl. Phenomenal question. Let me answer Barbo's question real quick. So Barbo Training on Instagram asked, would you be apprehensive in fixing infrasternal angle and this affecting shoulder kinematics with throwing athletes, especially prior to sport, for example, with the quarterback? I actually answered a question like this on a prior debrief, Barbo. I'll link it in the show notes. But it was my PRI versus DNS one. And I think we give ourselves way too much credit, because we think that, especially with higher level athletes, by giving them a silly variability exercise, that's going to break them. So can we say that doing a simple activity to restore shoulder motion being a problem for an individual? It's really hard to say. If I were a gambling man, I would say no, unless it was like right before a competition and you messed up with their juju a little bit or some of their routines. That would be the one time where it'd be like, yeah, maybe I wouldn't introduce something new. But I don't think that by establishing shoulder range of motion in these people that you're going to do something problematic to them. Because there's nothing to say that as soon as they get up and they go into their sport that is lost. So I don't think that it is as impactful as we think it is. I do think addressing variability is very impactful for pain. It's impactful for getting people into positions that they can't get into. But is it going to ruin someone's performance? Doubtful. So that's my thoughts, Barbo. I'm willing to be wrong, though. When I worked in the league, now we didn't work with a lot of overhead throwing athletes, unless you count, or I don't know, shooting a basketball and overhead throwing thing. I never screwed up anyone's shot by giving them a all fours activity or anything like that, or a right glute max, or a 90-90 pullover, or a bear position. So I think it'd be hard. You would be hard pressed to say that this stuff would be problematic for people. Just my opinion, though. Last question comes from Spark BMX Training. Could I pontificate? Anterior versus posterior shoulder impingement, particularly left shoulder. One client has a sense of tightness on the back of her left shoulder that we can't seem to clear up. Spark BMX Training, pontificate I shall. So, what is impingement? That's a great question. Theoretically, it's impingement if impingement is normal. Impingement happens all the time. But it's when two bones contact one another. It becomes a problem when it's painful. And in this case, impingement, I would assume, is likely occurring with some type of range of motion limitation. And I think that's the biggest key that we have to consider when we're talking about any type of impingement, whether it's an anterior or a posterior impingement, because the bones are going to contact a lot sooner if variability isn't restored in a particular joint. Because if you don't have as much room, there's going to be a little bit more bony contact. It's the closed pack position. So with any type of impingement, regardless of symptom location, your top priority has to be variability restoration. Now, variability restoration at the shoulder, we have to look at a few key tests to know, does this person have variability? There's 3 tests that I look at personally that make the biggest clinical decision making, 4 tests. If we're talking about some type of shoulder impingement and restoring variability at the shoulder. All of these tests are proxy measures for the rib cage. Because you can do all you want to the glenohumeral joint, but if the scapula is sitting on a funky position in the rib cage, and that is the limiting factor for a person having a range of motion limitation and a subsequent impingement, you're going to be putting a square peg in a round hole. You're not going to get any progress. So you have to address the underlying cause, or at least the underlying bones that are putting the shoulder where it is. And so here's what I think about. 4 tests. Guess what number 1 is, guys? The infrasternal angle. That's always going to be top priority for me until I am shown something better. And I hope I am shown something better. But infrasternal angle first. I have talked about that ad nauseum. I will link about this in the show notes. But if you're narrow, arms forward, long exhales. If you're wide, arms overhead. Forceful exhales, but still long. Do that first. What else do you need to look at? 3 tests that are at the shoulder joint specifically, but have nothing to do with the shoulder joint, I think. First one, horizontal abduction. What we're in theory looking at with that is how well does T1 to T7 rotate, or T1 to T8-ish. You got to think about where the scap sits. So scapula roughly runs from about T2 to T8. So if I move my shoulder this way, I can also create that same movement by doing this. So what I did was horizontal abduction. I can also rotate my trunk, if I'm talking my left shoulder, to the right, and that creates a relative horizontal abduction at that left shoulder. So if that's limited, that person cannot rotate T1 to T7 that well. So what do? Things to help T1 to T7 rotate. What I like, depends on the infrasternal angle, but a lot of times, a lot of the pec stuff that I've talked about previously, so like your diamond bear, sideline pec twist, I'll link them both in the show notes. Those are both really good activities to restore that motion on people who have limitations. On a wide, it's a little bit different. For those people, I would still do overhead-based activities, so maybe a bar hang. And if you can't do the bar hang, Lucy Hendricks just put on a good video where she's doing like a cable bar hang. Like, that's also a good one. I'll link that in the show notes. Both of those are very worthwhile. What else would I look at? External and internal rotation. These are big. And what I think they're looking at is what's going on in the anterior portion of the rib cage and what's going on in the posterior portion of the rib cage, and from a respiration standpoint. For example, if I do posterior thorax expansion, the scapula is going to relatively protract. If I can't do that, then the scapula is going to be relatively retracted. And I'm being very, very gross about my explanations. There's probably some other stuff going on, but let's just say, for the sake of argument, if I don't have posterior thorax expansion, the scapula is retracted. Because when I breathe in, air pushes the scap forward. If my scapula is relatively retracted, what that's going to do is that's going to make the distance from the humerus to the sternum increased. That is going to make your pec major eccentrically oriented, or long, whatever you want to call it. I like eccentric orientation because it's still active, right? It's not long and weak. It's just not in a good position. So then, guess what? When you go to test external rotation, you hope your darndest that it's limited. Otherwise, you got problems, fam. So what do? You do things to improve posterior thorax expansion. So anything short-seated, anything where you're reaching forward to drive air back there, anything like that. Posterior thorax expansion is necessary if you have an external rotation limitation. After you've addressed infrasternal angle, after you've done the best you can to restore trunk rotation. The caveat with that. With internal rotation, it's the exact opposite. So if I can breathe in the front side of my chest, I have pump handle activity. What that's going to do is that's going to push the scapula back into retraction, relative retraction. If I can't do that, and the pump handle is down, the scap's going to be a little bit more forward. Then what happens is when I go ahead and I try to test internal rotation, besides all of the posterior musculature, so your cuff muscles being in an eccentric position, but because I've altered where the glenoid is facing and the position that I've checked the humerus in, I could potentially get some type of posterior superior impingement. So you get an internal rotation limitation. So what does a person with an IR limitation need? Assuming you've done the infrasternal angle stuff, they need something in the front to expand the pump handle action of the rib cage so it pushes the shoulder back. What you're trying to do is find that middle ground between getting anterior and posterior expansion, pump handle up, posterior thorax expanding, so the shoulder sits in a nice position and you can rotate both directions, external and internal. If you address that, if you address horizontal abduction and superseding all of that, you got a good infrasternal angle, a lot of times the impingement cleans up. And that's really what I'm looking at from a shoulder standpoint when I'm working with people. So things that I use to address all of those areas, talked about infrasternal angle, I mentioned the trunk rotation stuff. I talked about external, how you want posterior thorax expansion. Anything to get pump handle. Bill's got a great video where he does the dorsal rostral thoracic expansion. Right, I'll link that in the show notes. I do a lot where I'm holding the hands together and pressing hard because, guys, the pecs can help with pump handle activity of the rib cage. That's another reason why I love these muscles so much. But doing that and then slowly working overhead with an inhale, down with an exhale, that theoretically should allow the pump handle mechanism to occur. You can restore shoulder IR with that. I've done it. I do it day in and day out. But I think, to summarize, if you look at those tests and you restore variability, the chances of you still having impingement after that are significantly reduced. And if you're addressing variability, you're addressing it in a sequential order that makes sense, and to even link it back to some of the other stuff that we talked about, you're taking into account how respiration works and the respiratory mechanism, you're going to do okay. You're going to help people with shoulder impingement. You're going to help increase variability, and you're going to help your people reach their movement goals. That's what I got for shoulder impingement, and I think that's about all I got for tonight. I want to thank you beautiful, sexy, outstanding people for tuning in to episode number 41. And I'm sure you're wondering before you leave, Zach, Where can I find out more about you? Well, I'm glad you asked. First off, go to zachcouples.com. Lauren, I'm glad you like it. Go to zachcouples.com. You'll want to do a bunch of things while you're there, but the first thing I would do is subscribe to my newsletter, because here's what you're going to get. You're going to get almost 3 hours of me talking about pain and breathing. You're going to get almost 50 pages of notes. You're going to get a free, yes, free, acute chronic workload calculator if you've read some Tim Gabbett stuff and you use that with your people. You're also going to get access to weekend learning goodies every Friday. I'm going to send you a little email saying, hey, you should check this out, and this out, and you're going to love it. And all your friends will be jealous that you are on the newsletter and they are not. And then they'll get on the newsletter and then you guys can talk about stuff. That's what I would do first. Once you've done that, then you want to go to the online services page and you want to sign up for 3 things, all at once preferably. First, you want to do a movement consultation. What you're going to do for that is you're going to work with me live in a setting such as this. Well, not everyone's going to watch, but in a setting such as this. I'm going to see how well you move in 3 planes. Them little shoulder tests I just talked about, we're going to do them. And what that can do is help you. If you're a little toy, maybe you got some limitations, maybe you got some boo-boos with some stuff, and you've tried the conventional route and it just ain't working, and you thought, hey, you know what? Maybe if I move better, this might not hurt. I can be your guy. Hit me up for a movement consultation. Then you're probably thinking, man, that was cool. I want to do that with my peeps. Well, guess what? If you join the mentorship program, I could talk you through it. I could teach you how to do it. I can teach you how to do things that I do. Among other things, I can help you get buy-in with your clients. Organizational stuff. I got a couple mentees I'm working with right now where we're doing a bunch of things to help them be more organized, streamline their day so they can meet their goals. The routines post I talked about this week, let's live it together. That is the mentorship program. And the last thing, if you want to get jacked, if you're post-rehab, you want to have better athletic performance, or you want to lean out, you definitely want to sign up for me with online training. What we'll do is we'll do a movement consultation, and then I will design a program tailored to your goals, your needs, your hopes and dreams. We'll chat weekly saying, hey, how's this going? Do we need to make any adjustments on the fly? And then we'll do it again until you are killing life because you got gains. Hit me up for the online training. Once you've done that, you'll definitely want to subscribe to the Zach Couples Show on iTunes or Stitcher, whatever you prefer. Because guess what, folks? There's 40 other debriefs that I've done if you're a new listener. And you can't look at me forever. Go ahead, put me in the car with you. Be like we're riding in the passenger seat. Well, hopefully no one's sitting there. I'll sit in the back seat. I don't care. But if you sign up, please leave a review and listen to me in the car. Definitely check out iTunes and Stitcher. Zach Couples shows what you want to look up. Once you've done that, then you'll want to hit me up on social media. I'm in a few places. First off, I'm in Facebook. Just go to /Z Couples. You'll find me. Be my friend. I need a friend. And what I do there is I share things. I put some of my exercises on there. I do all sorts of wild and crazy stuff on social media. I'm trying to get a little bit better about it. It starts this week. Facebook first. Of course, you want to go to Twitter next. Handle is @ZCouples. We'll tweet back and forth and do Twitter-like things. And then, you know we got to check out that Instagram, baby. Instagram.com, Zach, Z-A-C, Couples, C-U-P-P-L-E-S. Definitely hit me up on YouTube. Just search Zach Couples. You'll find me there. You'll see a lot of videos. I think I have over 550 now. It's wild. You're going to want to watch them. Otherwise, folks, thank you for tuning in. You're wonderful. I can't wait to see you guys next week. I apologize about the time zone change, but I appreciate everyone listening in. It's Arizona. Well, actually, you know what? You guys should apologize for the time zone change because I didn't change, right? I'm still me. Arizona does not observe daylight savings time. But I do apologize that I had to move this late, or unless you are on the West Coast, then you're probably thanking me. So that's just the way it works. Maybe when I find a place or my next spot, which I will be moving soon, when I find my next spot, we'll find a better time that works for everyone. But thank you so much for tuning in. Keep it real, but not to the extent where things go wrong. Stay hungry, stay learning, stay moving, and I'll see you next time. Deuces.